BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Knidheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the murder in Mitre Square and looking at the book, Jack the Ripper and the East End. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to last week's Ripper Wednesday, where I was talking about the autobiography of Jack the Ripper. And in case you didn't hear that episode, I can perhaps condense it into a single sentence. No, I think I can do better than that. I can condense it into a single word: fabrication. At some point between 1927 and 1930, a manuscript was written where someone was pretending to be Jack the Ripper, and they signed it with the name James Willoughby Carnac. And then this manuscript was distributed worldwide in 2012. And as far as its authenticity is concerned, I have to be on the side of it being a fabrication, being skeptical, and also just raising a lot of doubts and concerns about the origins of this manuscript, but I must say that it really was one of the bigger disappointments for the channel, because I had been really looking forward to reading the autobiography of Jack the Ripper, but I will fully confess to you, I thought that it was purely going to be a novel, and I've discussed other novels before on this channel, such as I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter, as well as the story Ripper by Dean B. Cloud, which try to capture the thought process of the Whitechapel murderer, and those are just that. They are fictional stories where the Ripper is a character, and are not trying to be passed off as being authentic. So when I learned that someone was actually trying to present the autobiography of Jack the Ripper as an authentic manuscript from the killer himself, I just felt very let down and somewhat disappointed. But I thank you to everyone who listened to last week's episode. And, I do want to be clear about one thing. If it's a fabrication, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a hoax. It could have been a creative project that somebody had done between 1927 and 1930. It could have been something that was done in a similar tradition to the writings of Stephen Hunter and Dean B. Cloud that I was just talking about. It doesn't have to be purely fraudulent. It could have been something purely creative that was just never published and then obtained, passed around, and distributed. But we simply do not know. However, I'm definitely on the side of skepticism in regards to its authenticity, but I believed that it deserved a standalone episode because it holds its place in history as well as being part of the Whitechapel lore and the story of Jack the Ripper all the same. Now, to talk about today's episode, there are two new videos that are available on the channels Jack the Ripper Tour, run by Richard Jones, and House of Lechmere, run by Edward Stowe. And they were discussing the murder in Mitre Square, the Goulston Street graffito, and the bloody piece of an apron that was found near the Goulston Street graffito. And I have standalone episodes about the victims, of course, as well as on the Goulston Street graffito, which I invite everybody to listen to, as well as checking out some of my other Jack the Ripper content here on Black Box Online Radio. But I've never done an individual episode on the piece of the bloody apron. So let's go back to September 30th of 1888 and start from the beginning. Liz Stride is murdered in Berner Street, and this happens at maybe 12:56 a.m., 12:58 a.m., 1 a.m. on September 30th. Now, if this were the same killer, and people do dispute this, but if this were the same killer, then the Ripper would have hidden the shadows at Berner Street, escaped, and then made his way to Mitre Square, arriving in Mitre Square maybe at 1:15 a.m., or maybe even interacting with Catherine Eddowes at 1:15 a.m., and by 1:30 to 1:45 a.m., Catherine Eddowes is murdered, and her body is discovered at approximately 1:45 a.m. by P.C. Watkins. And on Jack the Ripper tour, Richard Jones asked an excellent challenge question, which I will explore now. When the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered by Watkins at 1:45 a.m., was the Ripper still hiding in the shadows in Mitre Square? And I would say absolutely not. I know it's a speculative statement, I know it's just a possibility, I know it's interpretive, and you can give your response in the comment section down below, but I don't think the Ripper would have been hiding in the shadows by 1:45 a.m., because everything else that we have seen from Jack the Ripper is that he is somebody who is extremely fast, he's extremely cunning, he has a lot of awareness, and he commits the crimes. He obtains what he wants from the crime scene, maybe taking the organs or mutilating the woman's body to a certain extent, and then the Ripper gets out of there. With one exception. If your suspect is Charles Lechmere, then he would not have done that at the murder of Polly Nichols. He would have jumped into character mode and just started to pretend that he was the man who discovered the body. But if your suspect is not Charles Lechmere, then the murder of Polly Nichols would have happened, and the Ripper would have heard Charles Lechmere coming, and then he would have ran away. He would have gone through the woods buildings, and he would have disappeared through the back alleys of Whitechapel, never to be seen or heard from until September 8th of 1888, when Annie Chapman was murdered. But it's the same concept. The Ripper does not linger around at the crime scenes for a very long time at Hanbury Street, definitely not at Berner Street. As soon as the Ripper was able to get away from at Berner Street, he got away. So I think something very similar would have happened at Mitre Square. Then, where did the Ripper go? And Richard Jones had Steve Blomer as a guest on Jack the Ripper tour, and Steve Blomer's been a guest many times. He is the author of the book Inside Bucks Row, and he has a new book coming out about Mitre Square in the near future. It'll be out in about 13 months at the time of this recording. But in terms of what they were proposing the Ripper did after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, Steve Blomer was openly admitting that he was piggybacking off of somebody else's analysis, and this person was named M.P. Priestley, and he wrote the book One Autumn in Whitechapel. He's also featured in the documentary The Unsolved Killings of Jack the Ripper as perhaps one of the lead presenters, one of the lead panelists. And this is that the Ripper would have gone north and then gone back south to Goulston Street. And at first, I was like, I love it. Because Steve Blomer's saying he probably went much farther north than M.P. Priestley is expecting, and then is going down south to Goulston Street. And the reason why I said I love it is because we don't have any sightings of the Goulston Street graffito, or any approximations for the Goulston Street graffito appearing until at least 2:25, 2:30 in the morning on September 30th of 1888. In anything that adds time to the Ripper's activities, anything that keeps the Ripper occupied, is something that I'm going to listen to and I'm going to consider. If the Ripper's going in one direction, changes his mind, turns around and goes in the opposite direction, I will hear something like that, even if you're adding several minutes to the timeline, because we don't have the Goulston Street graffito noticed immediately. Catherine Eddowes' body is found at 1:45 a.m., and the Goulston Street graffito and the bloody piece of apron aren't talked about until 2:25 to 2:59 a.m. This means that there's a large chunk of time that's unaccounted for, and we have P.C. Long patrolling Goulston Street more or less. He is on his beat, as some people like to say, and he didn't report seeing the apron. Okay, though, but I will come back to one thing. Steve Blomer also openly admitted that both he and M.P. Priestley have suspects who had a connection to the southbound direction. M.P. Priestley has a suspect named Albert Bockert, and Steve Blomer, of course, has Aaron Kosminski, and he openly admitted that they liked this thing, not only because of the time frames, but also because they had suspects, and it was beneficial to the narrative. And I don't like that type of thinking, because that's not using the evidence to lead to a suspect. That's pre-choosing a suspect and drawing an imaginary line to the evidence. So I kind of just had like a roller coaster moment. Oh, hey, what a good idea. Oh, hey, what a bad idea. And I guess I was a little bit down in the trenches because Steve Blomer also brought up one point about how the bloody piece of the apron could have ended up at Goulston Street. And he proposed that maybe all of this was there earlier and PC Long didn't notice it. Maybe the bloody piece of apron was in Goulston Street before, and PC Long didn't notice it because when he was walking in one direction, it was more difficult for the piece of the apron to see. And I was thinking, I don't like that type of thinking. That's like a cop-out. That's almost just fudging the facts and fudging the explanation. Then, when I had just heard Edward Stowe discuss that same thing on his channel, The House of Lechmere, he said, almost the same thing that I just did. And I'm like, whoa, now wait a second. He said something to the effect of, well, the bloody piece of the apron wasn't noticed until around 2:30 a.m. on September 30th. Or, let's be clear, there is no account of it before 2:30 when PC Long is going by at 2:20. He didn't see any bloody piece of an apron, so most likely it wasn't there. And I was like, wait a second. What if Steve Blomer was right? What if that was right? Even though I said that I didn't like the explanation when I first heard it, once, we look at the possibilities, I still had to admit that that's a defendable possibility, that it was already on the ground and somebody just didn't notice it, or in the direction that one person was walking, it might have been more difficult to see than from the other direction. That's just real life. So I would propose that that's a reasonable suggestion. Even the Goulston Street graffito not being recognized until 2:30 to 3 a.m., or maybe the time frame for the Goulston Street graffito being written is much larger. The Goulston Street graffito was not very big. When you look at adaptations of Jack the Ripper in movies, they try to make it seem like the Goulston Street graffito was this enormous thing that took up multiple sections of a building or something like that. But we're talking about letters that are 3/4 of an inch high that went over 2 black bricks on Goulston Street. This was a very small graffito, but we do have the piece of the bloody apron there that could suggest that this was something that actually was Ripper related. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. And Edward Stowe went into great detail about how maybe the Goulston Street graffito was transcribed improperly, maybe it was actually saying this, maybe it was actually written this way, maybe the word Jews wasn't misspelled the way that people thought it was, and I simply would say it's all the same end result. That is an ambiguous statement. That is just something that we can't get any context or meaning from. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, because it's still not clear if that's saying that Jewish people are good or Jewish people are bad. With the context that we have, this little message written on the bricks of a building in Goulston Street, we really do not have any information to know which way this is leading. And I even say that the Goulston Street graffito is the clue in the Jack the Ripper case that makes no sense, that adds more questions than answers. Lots of high-profile unsolved mysteries have them, and I talk about other cases here on Black Box Online Radio. Once again, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along. But we've talked about the Zodiac Killer, D.B. Cooper, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. In the D.B. Cooper case, it's absolutely the money find at Tina Bar, the clue that adds more questions than answers. In the JonBenet Ramsey case, it's the ransom note, the clue that adds more questions than answers. And in the Ripper case, the Goulston Street graffito. But let's focus on the apron piece now. How did the piece of apron get to Goulston Street? Now, one thing that was mentioned by both Edward Stowe and Steve Blomer was, there's a book out there called Jack the Ripper, the 21st Century Investigation by Trevor Marriott, who is proposing that Catherine Eddowes may have cut off the piece of apron herself, and she may have walked down Goulston Street earlier that night, and she was using the piece of the bloody apron as a sanitary napkin. And Edward Stowe also even said that Marriott had proposed one thing that I had never heard before, that a rat may have taken the bloody piece of apron from Mitre Square to Goulston Street. With both of these explanations, the bloody piece of an apron was a sanitary napkin. It was moved by a rat. with both of these explanations, I would put them in the category of, we can't comment on that until you give us more information, until Trevor Marriott would provide more substantial pieces of evidence that would support that hypothesis, then I couldn't accept it. That just goes into the category of it's going out in far out wacky directions, and it doesn't appear to be supported by any type of fact. It's just almost stretching the limits of possibilities. And I want to appreciate outside the box thinking. I want to appreciate people who think differently and are trying to leave no stone unturned and looking at all the possibilities, but at the same time, when you say something like that, it's just not supported by fact. And if it is, then anybody going with that particular type of theory needs to provide better evidence to support that. Not just looking at, oh, well, maybe she could have done it. Of course, somebody could have done it. The Ripper also could have done it. So why would you go with that explanation? Or the rat could have done it. I mean, at that point, you're just throwing the blame on anybody to try and make sense of things. And that's not good, because that's not evaluating the evidence. Once again, that's just taking person X and drawing the imaginary line to the evidence, drawing the imaginary line to the crime scene. So let's look at one other possibility. Recently, I had the opportunity to interview Denise Diana Huddle, and she is the author of the book Anthrax to Zodiac, and I'll be talking to her and putting out the interview on my next Zodiac Monday. And her take on the Jack the Ripper case was really quite simple. I told her that, hey, I'm doing this episode on the Bloody Apron. How do you think the piece of the Bloody Apron got from Mitre Square to Goulston Street? And what she said was that she thought that it might have even been stuck to the Ripper's clothing himself. Like, the Ripper did it. Like, to be clear, it was Jack the Ripper, and Jack the Ripper goes down Goulston Street, but he might not have even known that the bloody piece of apron was stuck to his clothing, and it simply just fell off, meaning that there was no calculation, there was no reason for the Ripper to even do that. He did it unintentionally and unknowingly. Now, that type of thinking, I think, is a little bit better. That's better than saying a rat did it. But in terms of the more contemporary opinions, I think most people who follow the Ripper case are of a handful of opinions and mindsets. And that is that, number one, why is the bloody piece of apron in Goulston Street? Jack the Ripper cut the apron himself, and he took it intentionally. I think that is the most widely held belief. Steve Bloomer brought up one explanation that he did not support, but he said that the Ripper could have taken it to preserve the organs when he's cut out the kidney of Catherine Eddowes and perhaps the uterus. He used the bloody piece of apron to carry the organs, but Steve Bloomer openly dismissed that because there isn't a giant piece of blood, or there isn't a giant circle of blood that is in the center of the apron piece. So it definitely doesn't look like it was used to bundle up organs. I also think that would be a ridiculous explanation, because if Jack the Ripper took the organs, well, why on earth would he preserve them in a fragment of the apron? Did he actually cut the kidney in half, fry it, and eat it? And I mean, if he had the awareness to do something like that, he definitely just could have washed it first. There would be absolutely no reason or benefit for Jack the Ripper to wrap organs in a fragment of the apron. Was the Ripper really that concerned with sanitary issues, ripping Catherine Eddowes' body apart and, touching her blood with his bare hands, allegedly, and then he's gonna wrap the organs in a fragment of the apron to preserve them? I think that is an unnecessary detail that is not in line with the mindset of Jack the Ripper, or based on everything that we know about Jack the Ripper. Point number two. And this is one that is a little bit more widely held, and one that I've entertained heavily here on Ripper Wednesday. Jack the Ripper took the piece of the apron himself, and then he went to a place to hide because he was injured. Maybe he cut his hand, maybe he cut his leg when he's on top of Catherine Eddowes and he's cutting her. He realizes that he is bleeding, so he cut off a piece of the apron, and he's trying to either wrap it around his hand or apply pressure to his leg. That's why when there is the blood on the apron, it could actually have been some of the Ripper's own blood himself. but these crimes occurred in 1888, and DNA testing did not exist, so you couldn't even necessarily know too much about that. I mean, the DNA evidence was not well preserved, and of course we do have DNA reportedly on a shawl that was owned by either Catherine Eddowes or by the Ripper himself. Maybe it's a table runner, and that DNA is also not reliable. So I do think that this is a defendable one. And out of all the possibilities that I've talked to you about the reasons how and why this piece of apron ended up in Goulston Street, it's one that I've heavily entertained this year. You might even say for a while it was my go-to theory, that the Ripper attacked Catherine Eddowes, he cut himself, then he went to a hiding place. He's like not hiding in Mitre Square, no, he got away from Mitre Square because that's what the Ripper does, and he's applying pressure to a wound for maybe 20 minutes, then he leaves, and then he writes the Goulston Street graffito. In the past, for the longest time, I thought the Ripper did not write the Goulston Street graffito. I just thought that it was an unrelated piece of writing, and that the Ripper dropped the apron, though. I would still say, though, how did the apron piece get to Mitre Square? Jack the Ripper did it. I think he intentionally took the apron. I think that he was perhaps using it maybe even for something simpler. Something simpler than bandaging his own wound temporarily or putting pressure on his own wound. He could have just done it because he had too much blood on his hands. And like we're talking about excessive amounts of blood, he used it to wipe things off his hands, and that's why he dropped the apron, because it was of no use to him, and he didn't think that they were going to be able to collect any evidence, or maybe he was just a little bit berserk at the time. What do you think? How do you think the apron got to Goulston Street? How did the fragment of Catherine Eddowes' apron get from Mitre Square to Goulston Street? Please put your response in the comment section down below. And right now I would like to shift gears and talk about the book Jack the Ripper and the East End. And it features an introductory statement written by Peter Ackroyd. His name is on the cover of the book. However, this one, it was written by various writers. And I heard about this one on the Ripper Cast, and longtime listeners of Ripper Wednesday will know that I follow the Ripper Cast, the podcast about Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders, and they had Paul Begg on as a guest, who has written numerous books about Jack the Ripper, and he also wrote the commentary notes in the autobiography of Jack the Ripper, like the afterword and such. And there was a book that he was talking about called Jack the Ripper and the East End, and he made the claim that some people put the name Jack the Ripper on this book, Jack the Ripper and the East End, yet the book has nothing to do with Jack the Ripper, and the book is only about the East End of London, and they were trying to use the popularity of the Ripper to share and distribute their book. So I decided to pick up the book from Amazon.com and see for myself, and it appears that there are 2 sections in it which do talk about Jack the Ripper. For the most part, it seems like Paul Begg is correct. The book is about 80% unrelated to the Ripper, and then 20% of it actually talks about the Ripper's crimes. But definitely the Ripper is mentioned. I'm going to go through the writings of Peter Ackroyd in just a second, but to provide some context, you will find chapter names such as The Geography of Whitechapel, or discussing the contemporary times of Whitechapel in 1888, and to the credit of Paul Begg, I don't necessarily think that that would be Jack the Ripper related, unless you actually want to give the title 100% clarity and say that it's a justification. The Whitechapel Geography of 1888 could be Ripper related if you want to use it as a resource, but 80% unrelated to the Ripper, 20% related to the Ripper. Well, what does this book, Jack the Ripper and the East End, which has been mostly called a scam book, say about the Ripper at all? If we're going to be talking about Catherine Eddowes and the murder in Mitre Square in this one, let's look at the writings of Peter Ackroyd. The body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered by Constable Watkins of the City of London Police Force at around 1:45 a.m. on September 30th of 1888. He explained to the coroner and the jury at the Eddowes inquest that his patrol beat was between 12 and 14 minutes, and at 1:30 a.m. there had been nothing that had excited his attention in Mitre Square. And I think all of that is probably going to be rather accurate. The only thing that I'm concerned about is, in the absolute first couple of videos that I watched about Jack the Ripper when I was preparing this segment years ago, and doing one of my first Ripper episodes, some people were estimating that Jack the Ripper actually met up with Catherine Eddowes at 1:15 a.m., not 1:30 a.m. But, 1:15 is almost seeming like that's a very generous estimation. At 1:15, because we don't necessarily know how long the Ripper would have been hiding in the shadows in Burner Street, maybe even just a minute. Liz Stride could have been murdered at 12:58 a.m., and then Louis Deemschutz arrives 1 a.m., goes inside the working club, and then the Ripper is able to get out. But that would still be like 1:01 a.m., 1:02 a.m., 1:03 a.m. 15 minutes would still put him at about 1:20. The real significance of the sequence of crimes lies elsewhere. It lies in the locality of the murders, known generally as the East End. So now we have a reason why this book is called Jack the Ripper in the East End. One of the crimes actually took place in the city of London, but it was the East that took on the burden of the mystery and criminality. It was the East that was seen as the harbinger of death and decay. The press of the time prompted that hysterical response. The crimes of Jack the Ripper did not herald the birth of tabloid journalism that was already latent in pamphlets of the 17th and 18th centuries, but the salacious reporting of sensational events became imprinted in the public consciousness as a result of the events of the autumn and winter of 1888. Well, we also have the summer of 1888, too. We have the spring of 1888, when the Whitechapel murders truly begin. Emma Smith being murdered in the spring of 1888. Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols, and Annie Chapman are murdered in the summer of 1888. And then Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes would be murdered in the fall. It was the most lurid of all press seasons. Every new turn of this bewildering labyrinth, the Star wrote on September 14th, reveals some fresh depth of social blackness and some strange repulsive curiosity of human nature. What are we to do? Where are we to turn? The newspapers were filled with headlines and horrors. Ghastly murder in the East End. One front page informed its readers, dreadful mutilation of a woman. Well, also, to be very clear, you might call that sensationalism. It also appears like those things are completely true. Fanciful illustrations and drawings abounded. This was a new era when the reading public was being informed, and it was possible to define the storm of comment and controversy as the true birth of what has become known as the popular press. The potent combination of sexuality and criminality was too tempting to be resisted, and so the East End became generally depicted as the heart of darkness. The phrase itself, East End, was not invented until this decade. So overall, you can see that there are some very strong statements there, but the newspapers have been heavily criticized in the world of Jack the Ripper. The press has been heavily criticized. You heard the stuff about the sensationalism, but in a lot of ways, they are just reporting on the events of the time, and I know that the newspapers would have benefited from this. And I know that the newspapers would have enjoyed the coverage, and they would have enjoyed the opportunity to sell and share all of their papers. But at the same time, when they're just saying that there's a ghastly murder that took place, these are some of the most ghastly murders that ever occurred, especially the murder of Mary Kelly, which might be the most ghastly murder of all time. So I think that there needs to be a certain amount of credit given to people who were simply reporting on the facts. And furthermore, I do give credit to Peter Ackroyd when he's talking about how we had a general populace that was perhaps a little bit more literate than it was in, let's say, 1200 or 1300 AD-CE, and then you have people who can actually digest the news and share the news. And yes, people could read before 1888, I'm very well aware of that, but I do see his point when he's saying that, okay, now we have a populace that is becoming more literate, so more people are going to be reading, more people are going to be sharing the stories, and there is a certain amount of Ripper mania that was created. And let's not kid ourselves, the mania never went away. The story of Jack the Ripper has definitely been highly publicized, and it really stands out in people's minds, I think, number one, because of the simplicity of it, but as Richard Jones of the previously mentioned Jack the Ripper Tour channel points out, The Ripper sent the first 2 letters, or somebody pretending to be him, to the Central News Agency, so that they went out on the wire. And this story received national coverage and then international coverage. When you had people in the United States of America talking about what was going on in 1888, and people in the state of Texas saying, "Oh my goodness, there's a Ripper going on in England." Well, I think that this was the Ripper who attacked our girls in 1884 and 1885, the servant girl annihilator, the midnight assassin. People all over the world knew about Jack the Ripper. And it's the simplicity of the Ripper's Autumn of Terror, where only 5 women were murdered, and then all of the other victims are just referred to as what? Non-canonical. So the amount of coverage that was shared definitely affected public perception. More people could read, that also affected the public perception. And the murders were indeed ghastly and grisly, and there were illustrations of the women's dead bodies, but guess what? That's what actually happened. These women were murdered in horrific ways by Jack the Ripper. So I think that a certain amount of credence needs to be given to the reporters. A certain amount of credit needs to be given to the reporters and the illustrators all the same. Well, thank you so much for listening to this week's Ripper Wednesday. I would really love to know what you think. How and why did the piece of the apron get from Goulston Street to from Mitre Square to Goulston Street? How and why did the piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron get from Mitre Square to Goulston Street? Was it the rat? You can tell me no if you don't think it was a rat. Was it the Ripper doing it unintentionally? Was it stuck to his clothing? Did the Ripper use it to cover a wound and then drop it there himself? Did the Ripper use it only to clean his hands and then drop it there himself? Please give your responses in the comments section down below. If you watch the videos on Jack the Ripper tour as well as on House of Lechmere, you can also give your feedback. Share anything that you want. And I will let you guys know that tomorrow, here on Black Box Online Radio, I will be going live talking about the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. And if you're listening to this in the future, please feel free to check out my episode on the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. Every Thursday is Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio, where I talk to you guys about the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947, another ghastly and grisly murder that was heavily publicized for some very similar reasons. But I also talk about the Zodiac Killer on Mondays. Now I'm doing a segment about the disappearance of Maura Murray on Tuesdays, and of course on Fridays talking about D.B. Cooper. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on Facebook, Instagram, and here on YouTube. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. My Instagram name is blackboxonlineradio. And of course you have the YouTube channel Black Box Online Radio. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday, and for now, I will turn it over to you guys in the comments section, and I'll see you tomorrow for an episode about the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. Until next time.